She thought the farm was empty, left to rot for 30 long years. But the moment she opened that rusted gate, something stirred in the shadows. A lone German shepherd stood waiting, guarding the past as if it never truly left. And what began that day would become a story of loyalty, love, and a miracle only God Himself could have written. Before we begin her journey, please take a second to hit the subscribe button. It means more than you know. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Chapter 1. The Old House by Cedar Creek. The late autumn sky hung low over the winding road, the color of old pewter and the scent of wet earth thick in the air. The creek murmured somewhere beyond the hill, a slow whisper through reeds and broken stones, as if it too remembered. Martha Lewis gripped the steering wheel of her rusted blue pickup truck, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. The years had weathered her face, softening the sharpness of youth into lines carved by sorrow and endurance. Her once dark hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled into a loose braid that brushed the collar of her faded denim jacket. She had the sturdy frame of a woman who had known labor, neither fragile nor heavy-set, but built by decades of standing on her feet, cleaning houses, lifting boxes, tending to whatever life threw her way. Her brown eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, carried a glint of quiet resolve, like embers that refused to die. Beside her sat Duke, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a coat of black and tan fur gone pale around the muzzle. His amber eyes watched the world outside with calm intelligence. Duke had been with her since her husband, Paul, passed away 5 years ago, her last gift from him before the cancer took its toll. The dog had grown slower now, his once springing gait replaced by a dignified stiffness in his limbs, but his loyalty had not dimmed. He rested his head on Martha's thigh, a silent comfort against the loneliness that rode with her in the cab. Every bump in the road made the truck shudder, and each mile toward Cedar Creek felt like peeling back another layer of time she wasn't sure she wanted to face. 32 years ago, she had sworn never to return. Cedar Creek had been her childhood prison and her first heartbreak. Her father, Henry Lewis, a proud but stern farmer, had worked himself into the grave before she turned 20. Her mother followed not long after, and the house, small, creaking and built of pine that smelled like old rain, had been sold to pay debts. She had left the next day for the city, vowing she would never again wake to the sound of that damned creek. But the city, too, had taken its toll. Paul's death, the layoff from the factory, the bills that piled like autumn leaves, it all came down to this: one woman, one truck, one dog, and a past waiting at the end of a forgotten dirt road. As the truck turned off the paved highway, the dirt track to the old house came into view, narrow, half swallowed by weeds and thorn. Duke lifted his head, ears twitching. "Almost there, boy," Martha murmured, her voice roughened by fatigue. Her breath fogged against the cold glass. The landscape unfolded around them, low hills cloaked in dry grass, fence posts leaning like weary soldiers, the skeletal remains of an orchard her father once tended. And then she saw it, the house by the creek. The sight struck her with the force of an old wound reopened. The roof sagged like a tired back. Ivy strangled the porch railings, and the chimney leaned precariously, a sentinel losing its balance. Yet despite its decay, the place still held a kind of stubborn dignity. The cedar shingles, though rotted, caught the faintest glint of sun through the clouds, as if refusing to surrender. Martha parked the truck and sat still for a moment, listening to the ticking of the engine and the quiet hum of memory. When she stepped out, the air hit her with the sharpness of rust and pine. Duke followed, stretching his hind legs before trotting ahead, nose to the ground. "Careful," she called softly. Her boots sank slightly into the damp earth as she walked toward the porch. The boards groaned under her weight. She ran her fingers along the doorframe, splintered, cold, familiar. For an instant, she saw herself as a little girl, barefoot and sunburned, standing in this very spot calling for her father to come home. But the image vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the reality of peeling paint and silence. Inside, the air smelled of dust and time. Light filtered weakly through broken shutters, illuminating motes that danced like ghosts. The kitchen was nearly as she remembered, the old wood stove rusted shut, the counters covered in a thin layer of grime, the window over the sink cracked, but still offering a glimpse of the creek glimmering in the distance. Martha set down her bag and stood still, listening. The silence felt heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Duke padded in beside her, tail low but wagging softly. She spoke aloud to him, though her words were really for herself. "Well, Duke, looks like it's just you and me now." He barked once, short, affirming. The sound echoed through the hollow house, startling a small flock of sparrows from the rafters. They burst upward in a flurry of wings, and for a brief moment the house felt alive again. Martha explored the rooms one by one, the parlor with its warped floorboards, the narrow staircase leading to the attic, the bedroom where her mother's old quilt still lay folded at the foot of a sagging bed. Every object she touched seemed to hum with memory. She tried to push back the ache that rose in her chest, but it was useless. Grief, she had learned, doesn't disappear. It only changes shape. As dusk crept in, she started a small fire in the stove using kindling from a fallen beam. The smoke curled through the chimney with a reluctant sigh. Duke lay at her feet, his eyes half closed, his breathing steady. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sit still, to not rush, not plan, not pretend to be fine. The creek murmured beyond the window, a lullaby from another life. Her thoughts drifted to Paul, his laugh deep and unguarded, the way he used to call her Marcy when no one else did. The day he told her he had bought Duke as a pup because, in his words, every good woman deserves a loyal friend who can't talk back. She smiled faintly through the sting in her eyes. "You'd like it here, Paul," she whispered. "It's quiet." The night settled heavier, shadows stretching long across the floor. Somewhere outside, an owl called, its cry low and mournful. Martha rose to check the doors, more out of habit than fear, when Duke suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked. He growled, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the stillness. "What is it, boy?" she asked, pausing by the window. The creek shimmered faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, she thought she saw something move by the edge of the water, a shape too tall for an animal, too still for wind. Her pulse quickened. The figure lingered, or perhaps it was only her eyes playing tricks in the half-light. Duke barked once, sharp and warning. When she looked again, the shape was gone. Only the reeds swayed, whispering softly in the dark. Martha exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her chest. "It's just shadows," she murmured, though her voice trembled. Duke stayed alert, gaze fixed on the creek. For a long while, neither of them moved. The fire crackled, the night hummed, and somewhere outside, the creek seemed to whisper her name. Chapter 2. The Sigh of Earth and Wind. The morning after the shadow by the creek, Martha woke to a brittle silence that seemed almost watchful. The fire in the stove had long gone out, leaving only faint gray curls of smoke winding through the cold air. Duke lay curled near the hearth, one ear twitching even in sleep. Outside, the pale light of dawn filtered through fog that clung low over Cedar Creek like a ghost reluctant to leave. Martha rubbed the stiffness from her hands, listening to the muted creak of the old house breathing around her. The sense of unease from the night before hadn't vanished. It had only changed shape, settling deeper, like roots pressing beneath the soil. Stepping outside, she was greeted by the sight of Cedar Creek stretched thin and tired. The windmill her father had once built stood twisted and broken, its blades dangling at odd angles. The old barn sagged under its own weight, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. Beyond it, the fields lay empty, cracked in places, and covered with patches of wild thistle. The earth seemed to sigh beneath her boots, an exhausted sound, as though the land itself remembered better days. Duke padded beside her, tail low, nose twitching at the scents that drifted on the morning wind. She spent most of the morning clearing debris near the porch, her breath fogging in the cool air. It felt strangely satisfying to do something, anything, that wasn't drowning in thought. Duke trotted off toward the edge of the property, barking occasionally at unseen critters. Around noon, she paused to drink from a canteen when Duke's bark changed. Sharp, urgent. Martha froze. "Duke!" she called, wiping her hands on her jeans. Another bark came, deeper this time, almost desperate. She dropped to the canteen and ran toward the sound, her boots crunching over frost-hardened ground. When she reached the old fence line, she found Duke crouched low, ears back, growling softly at something tangled in the broken boards. At first glance, it looked like a heap of brown cloth, but then it moved. Her breath caught. It was a horse, a young mare, maybe 5 or 6 years old, its coat a pale chestnut streaked with mud and sweat. One leg was caught in the splintered wood of the fence, and blood darkened the fur around its fetlock. The animal thrashed weakly, eyes wide with pain and panic. "Easy now," Martha whispered, kneeling slowly. She could smell the blood. sharp and metallic against the scent of wet earth. Duke stayed beside her, muscles taut, watching for any sudden movement. "Good boy," she murmured to him, then turned back to the horse. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're not going to hurt you." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. Years ago, when she was a child, her father had taught her how to calm the plow horses after a storm, how to speak low and slew, to move like the wind does through the grass. She hadn't touched a horse since then, but the memory came back like muscle memory, buried beneath time. She took off her jacket, draping it gently over the mare's eyes to calm her. The animal snorted, trembling, but stopped thrashing. Carefully, Martha wedged her boot under the broken plank and heaved. It gave way with a crack. The mare stumbled free, collapsing briefly before trying to stand. "Hold still, girl. Hold still," Martha murmured. She tore a strip from her sleeve and wrapped it tight around the bleeding leg. Duke nosed closer, sniffing the mare, then looked up at Martha with questioning eyes. "We'll call her Hope," Martha said softly, "because that's what she's got left." Hope whickered faintly, as if she understood. With Duke's help, though his help was mostly nervous pacing and quiet whining, Martha coaxed the horse toward the barn. The structure groaned under its own weight, but one stall near the back was still usable. She laid old hay there and fetched a bucket of water from the creek. Hope drank greedily, her sides heaving with exhaustion. As Martha brushed mud from the mare's coat with her bare hands, something unexpected welled up in her chest, a flicker of purpose, fragile but real. She wasn't just tending a wounded animal, she was tending a piece of herself she hadn't realized was still alive. Duke lay near the stall, head resting on his paws, his amber eyes watching every move she made. When the horse finally calmed, Martha leaned against the wall and let herself breathe. "You did good, boy," she whispered. Duke's tail thumped once against the dirt floor. The day slipped quietly into evening. A soft wind rose from the creek, carrying the scent of cedar and damp leaves. Martha sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, her body aching pleasantly from the day's work. Duke dozed at her feet, and for the first time since coming back, the silence didn't feel hostile. It felt full, like a pause between heartbeats. She looked out toward the barn, where Hope stood visible in the fading light, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. The peace didn't last long. Just as the first stars began to prick the sky, the crunch of gravel echoed from the road. Martha straightened, frowning. No one should be out here. A faint beam of light flickered between the trees, a lantern. Duke lifted his head and gave a low growl. The light drew closer, and soon a figure came into view, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his steps steady despite the uneven ground. He wore a brown canvas coat, patched at the elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. His beard was silvered and close-trimmed, outlining a jaw that spoke of strength more than pride. When he reached the gate, he lifted a gloved hand in greeting. "Evenin'," he said, voice deep and rough with years of hard living. "Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Sam Carter. Live just down the ridge." Martha hesitated. Duke stood stiff beside her, tail straight. "You're the first soul I've seen here in, 30 years," she said cautiously. Sam smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Not many left to see. Most folks moved on when the mills shut down. I stuck around." He set the lantern on the porch rail. Its light revealed the weathered lines of his face, the kind carved by sun and wind, not vanity. His eyes were gray, calm, but carrying the look of a man who's lost something he never stopped missing. He explained that he had seen smoke rising earlier that morning and wanted to check if someone had moved in, or if another fire had taken the forest. "Didn't expect to find someone brave enough to come back to Cedar Creek," he said, pulling off his hat. "You Lewis's girl, aren't you?" Martha nodded, surprised he remembered. "You knew my father?" "Knew of him," Sam replied. "Good man, hard man, the kind that made things work even when they shouldn't." His gaze softened. "Sorry about your folks. They were good people." She thanked him quietly. There was a long pause before he gestured toward the barn. "Saw you've got a horse. Where'd she come from?" Martha told him about Hope, about finding her tangled in the fence. Sam listened without interruption, nodding slowly. When she finished, he said, "You've got a good heart, Ms. Lewis. Most would have left her there." "Leaving's easy," Martha said, staring into her coffee. "I've done enough of that." Sam studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small paper sack. "Brought you something," he said. Inside were a loaf of bread and a jar of milk. "Fresh from my kitchen. Figured you might need a little help getting settled." It had been years since anyone had shown her kindness without wanting something in return. She met his eyes, and for a moment the world felt smaller, quieter, almost safe. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, tipping his hat. "You take care of that horse now. And yourself." As he walked away, the lantern light grew dimmer until it vanished into the darkness beyond the ridge. Martha stood on the porch long after he'd gone, the bread still warm in her hands, the wind whispering through the grass like an old song. Duke pressed close to her leg, and when she looked toward the barn, Hope lifted her head and snorted softly, as if to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. But as the night deepened, Martha thought she heard something new in the wind, low, rhythmic, almost human. She stepped off the porch, listening. The sound came from the direction of the creek, faint but clear. 3 slow knocks, like someone tapping wood beneath the water. Duke growled again, staring into the dark. Martha's heart thudded. "It's just the current," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. The air smelled suddenly colder. Somewhere beyond the trees, Cedar Creek sighed again, long and low, as though the land itself were trying to speak. Chapter 3. Revival. Winter crept quietly into Cedar Creek, not with sudden snow, but with a slow, patient chill that crept under door frames and whispered through cracks in the old wood. The air smelled of pine smoke and damp leaves. Martha rose before sunrise each morning now, something she hadn't done in years. The house, once hollow and cold, had begun to echo with small signs of life. The clatter of tin pails, the thud of Duke's paws on the porch, the rustle of Hope's movements in the barn. What had once been a ruin was now a rhythm. It was Sam Carter who made the rhythm possible. Since that first night with the lantern, he had become a steady presence in Martha's days. He arrived each morning around 8, his boots leaving deep prints in the frosted dirt, his breath steaming in the crisp air. Sam was a man built by the land, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a neck sunburned from decades under an unforgiving sky. His hair, more silver now than brown, curled slightly at the edges beneath his worn hat. There was a stillness to him, not of apathy, but of a man who had already faced the worst and lived to tell the story. The lines around his eyes deepened when he smiled, and though he rarely spoke of his late wife, Ellen, Martha could sense that he still carried her ghost gently, like a folded letter he would never throw away. They worked together without much need for words. Sam repaired the roof with slow, methodical precision, while Martha patched the cracks in the kitchen walls. Duke followed them everywhere, his aging body moving with loyal determination. When Sam chopped wood, Duke stood guard near the tree line, ears flicking toward the distant howls of coyotes. In the barn, he would lie close to Hope's stall, occasionally lifting his head to watch her. Hope had recovered well, her wound healed to a pale scar, her coat shining again. The horse had grown fond of Martha, nudging her shoulder whenever she passed. As the days lengthened, the property began to breathe again. Martha cleared the creek path and rebuilt the old stone well with Sam's help. The water that trickled up was cold and clean, untouched by years of neglect. They planted winter rye near the fence line, a fragile promise that the earth could still yield life. Every evening, Martha and Sam would sit on the porch, mugs of coffee warming their hands. They spoke of small things, the weather, the stubbornness of the roof, the time Duke chased a raccoon into the shed and nearly trapped himself. But beneath their easy laughter was something quieter, a pulse neither dared name. Martha had not imagined she could feel affection again, not like this. It wasn't the desperate, breathless love of youth, but a slow warmth that settled in the bones, like sunlight after a long winter. When Sam smiled at her, really smiled, she felt a kind of peace that frightened her in its simplicity. And yet, just as she began to believe in peace again, Cedar Creek reminded her that it was not done testing her. The storm came without warning. One moment, the air was heavy but still. The next, wind roared down the valley like a freight train. The sky darkened in an instant, clouds swirling above the ridges. Martha was inside, tending to the fire, when Duke began barking wildly. Hope whinnied in panic from the barn. "Sam!" Martha shouted, but he was already halfway across the yard, hammer in hand, trying to fasten the shutters before the wind tore them loose. Rain came hard and cold, slashing sideways. The roof rattled. The wind screamed through the trees. Martha grabbed her coat and ran out, shielding her face. "The barn!" she cried. Hope's frightened cries carried through the thunder. Duke sprinted ahead, his paws splashing through the mud. Lightning split the sky, revealing the barn door banging wildly on its hinges. Sam yelled over the storm, "Stay inside, Martha!" But she didn't listen. Together they fought against the wind, forcing the door open just enough to slip through. Inside, Hope was thrashing, her eyes white with terror. The old rafters groaned above them, and Martha could see daylight through gaps in the roof. Duke barked furiously, circling the horse to keep her from crashing into the walls. "Easy, girl," Martha called, reaching for the halter. The mare reared, hooves clattering dangerously close to her head. Sam grabbed a rope and looped it around a post, trying to steady her. Then came the sound, an awful crack like the world splitting. A beam from the roof gave way, crashing down between them. Martha fell backward, the air knocked from her lungs. Dust filled the air. "Martha!" Sam shouted, but his voice was drowned by the storm. Duke darted into the chaos, barking, his fur slicked with rain. He lunged forward, pushing at the fallen beam with his shoulders. Hope screamed again, trapped between panic and exhaustion. Martha scrambled to her knees, coughing. "Duke, no!" she cried, but the dog wouldn't stop. He wedged himself beside the beam, growling, muscles straining. With a final heave from Sam, the beam shifted enough for Hope to stumble free. The mare bolted toward the corner, trembling but alive. Then, in the next flash of lightning, Martha saw Duke lying still. "God, no," she whispered, crawling to him. Sam was beside her in seconds. They lifted the beam just enough to pull him out. His breathing was shallow, one paw twisted unnaturally. "Stay with me, boy," Martha begged, pressing her hands against his fur. Blood mixed with rainwater beneath her fingers. Sam wrapped his arm around her shoulders, voice low but firm. "He's a fighter. Don't give up on him yet." They carried Duke back to the house, wrapped in an old quilt. All night, Martha sat beside him on the floor by the fire, whispering prayers she hadn't said in decades. The storm raged on, tearing at the roof, shaking the windows, but she didn't move. She stroked his head gently, whispering his name over and over. When dawn came, the world outside was quiet again. The barn roof was half gone, the creek swollen and muddy. Sam stood by the window, looking out at the wreckage. Martha knelt beside Duke, who stirred at last, letting out a weak whine. Relief flooded her like light breaking through clouds. She pressed her forehead to his. "You came back to me," she whispered. Sam turned, his face soft with something more than sympathy. "So did you," he said quietly. For a long time, they sat there in silence, the kind that doesn't separate, but binds. Outside, the wind had gentled. Hope neighed faintly from the barn, alive and safe. Duke lifted his head enough to rest it on Martha's knee, eyes half open, trusting. She smiled through her tears. The storm had not taken them. It had tested them, and somehow they had endured. When Sam finally spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "You know, Martha, maybe the land's not the only thing that needed saving." She looked up at him, her eyes red but bright. "Maybe not," she said. Outside, the first light of morning touched the wet fields, turning every blade of grass into silver. Chapter 4. When Spring Returned. By the time the frost finally melted from the edges of the fields, Cedar Creek had begun to breathe again. The storm had stripped away the last remnants of neglect, leaving behind bare bones for Martha and Sam to rebuild. The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air, and each morning a thin mist rose from the creek, wrapping the land in silver before dissolving into sunlight. Martha stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of steaming coffee, watching Duke limp gently through the yard. His injury from the storm had left him slower, but not broken. The old dog still carried himself with quiet pride, tail wagging faintly as he inspected every corner of the property, as if ensuring the world remained in order. His fur had dulled to a soft gray around his face, his gait uneven yet steady, proof that devotion, even when wounded, never truly falters. Sam appeared from behind the barn, carrying a bundle of wooden planks on his shoulder. Sweat beaded his temple despite the cool air. The weeks since the storm had carved him leaner, but not weaker. The lines in his face had softened. "We'll have the roof done by tomorrow," he said, his deep voice steady as always. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. "You've been saying that for a week now, Sam Carter." He chuckled, setting the planks down with a soft thud. "Well, I like to make promises I can keep. Eventually." His humor was gentle, like the rest of him. Life had sanded down his rough edges, leaving behind a man who had learned patience the hard way. Years of loss had made him cautious, but in the warmth of Martha's presence, his reserve began to thaw. He had started to whistle while he worked, low, tuneless melodies that drifted through the open fields. Sometimes, Martha caught herself humming along without realizing. Hope had recovered fully, her coat now sleek and bright under the sun. She had given birth to a foal, a small, trembling creature with a white blaze across its nose and impossibly long legs. Martha named him Lucky, for being born after the storm that had nearly taken everything. Lucky's curious eyes followed Duke wherever he went, and the shepherd tolerated the foal's clumsy affection with dignified patience. Watching the three of them, Hope, Lucky, and Duke, Martha often felt as though life itself had returned to the land in quiet, breathing form. The days grew longer, and work filled each hour. Together, she and Sam repaired the barn roof, straightened the broken fences, and planted rows of corn and beans along the southern field. Martha's hands, once soft from city life, grew rough again, lined with cuts and calluses that made her strangely proud. The ache in her back each night reminded her that she was alive and living for something. Sam often stayed for dinner, sometimes bringing small gifts: a jar of honey from a beekeeper down the ridge, a bundle of wildflowers he'd found near the old road, once even a carved wooden spoon he'd made himself. "Not perfect," he'd said sheepishly when she unwrapped it, "but strong." "It's beautiful," Martha had replied, her voice soft, her eyes saying more than words could. One afternoon, as they were fixing the fence near the creek, a truck rumbled up the path, a sound rare in that quiet valley. A woman climbed out, her boots crunching the gravel. She was in her late 40s, tall and sturdy, with hair the color of sand tied back in a neat braid. Her name was Nancy Turner, a resident of the nearby town of Milford. Nancy had once known Martha's parents, and her sharp blue eyes softened with recognition when she saw her. "Lord, it's true," she said, removing her gloves. "Henry Lewis's girl come back after all these years." Nancy was a practical woman, broad-shouldered from farm work, with a blunt manner that made her seem sterner than she was. But beneath it was kindness born from hard living. She had heard about Martha's return through town gossip, and had come with a crate of supplies: nails, seed packets, and a loaf of fresh bread. "Figured you could use these," she said, setting them down on the porch. "The town's been talking about you, how you're bringing the old place back to life. Some thought Cedar Creek was gone for good." Martha smiled, though her throat tightened at the thought. "It almost was." Nancy glanced at Sam, who nodded politely, wiping sweat from his brow. "And who might you be?" she asked. "Sam Carter," he said simply. "Neighbor." Her grin widened just enough to tease. "Neighbor, huh? You look like more than that." Martha laughed for the first time in weeks, a deep, unguarded sound that startled even her. The sound of it made Sam look up, his eyes soft with quiet amusement. Nancy stayed a while, sharing stories of the old days and the town's news. The reopening of the mill, the church repairs, and how the young folks had started moving back. Before she left, she squeezed Martha's shoulder and said, "It's good to have life back out here. Feels like spring needed you to come first." In the weeks that followed, more visitors arrived, curious faces from town bringing small tokens: a bag of feed, a sack of flour, spare tools. They spoke of how they used to pass by the road and see only silence, how now they saw smoke rising from the chimney and knew that the land was no longer forsaken. Some came to help mend fences, others came just to sit and talk. It felt, to Martha, as if the valley itself was slowly remembering how to hope. Evenings became their own kind of sanctuary. Sam would linger after supper, and the two would sit outside beneath the glow of a lantern, Duke at their feet, and Hope grazing quietly in the field. The creek's song filled the stillness, steady and calm. Sometimes Sam would tell stories about his youth, the summer fairs, fishing with his father, the day he first met Ellen. Martha listened with her chin resting on her hands, feeling both sorrow and peace in his words. When she spoke of her own past, it was with less pain than before. The house, once haunted by memory, now felt like a part of her again, not a grave, but a garden. One evening, after a long day of planting, Martha looked out across the field. The last light of sunset spread gold across the hills, and she saw the faint shimmer of new grass pushing through the soil. "Would you look at that?" she said softly. "It's all coming back." Sam followed her gaze, then turned to her. "You did this, Martha." She shook her head. "No, we did." Duke lifted his head, tail wagging once as if in agreement. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the cedars, carrying with it the smell of earth and renewal. The past still lived in the corners of her heart, the storm, the loss, the long years of loneliness. But now it shared space with something new. Martha reached down, resting her hand on Duke's head. "We're home," she whispered. That night, as she drifted toward sleep, she thought she heard the creek outside again, not sighing this time, but laughing. Chapter 5. The Sunset Over the Old Field. Years passed, and time softened Cedar Creek into something almost sacred. The scars of the storm had long vanished beneath wildflowers and tall grass. The fences stood firm, the barn glowed warm in the light of each dawn, and laughter once again filled the air where silence used to live. Martha Lewis, her hair now fully silver, her face etched with the gentle lines of a life well weathered, moved through her days with the steady rhythm of someone who had finally made peace with time. Her hands, though wrinkled and rough, were still strong, still tender. When she smiled, her whole face glowed, as if the years had only refined her light instead of dimming it. Beside her walked Sam Carter, older but still solid as an oak. His beard had turned snow white, his eyes a paler gray now, yet full of quiet warmth. He carried himself with the same calm endurance that had once built barns and tamed storms. In town, people often said that Sam and Martha didn't just live at Cedar Creek. They belonged to it, as much a part of the land as the cedars that lined the creek itself. And then there was Duke, the old German shepherd, whose muzzle had turned nearly white. His steps were slower now, but his spirit remained unbroken. Each evening, like a ritual, he made his round across the fields, his figure outlined against the fading sun. The rhythm of his limp had become the evening's heartbeat, steady and reassuring. Sometimes, when the wind blew across the grass, it seemed to carry the echo of his younger bark, a reminder of storms weathered and lives saved. Cedar Creek had grown in ways Martha could never have imagined. What began as one woman's attempt to reclaim a forgotten home had become a sanctuary. People from nearby towns brought abandoned animals, dogs too old for adoption, cats left behind, even the occasional goat or chicken that someone couldn't keep. Martha never turned any away. "Every creature deserves a second chance," she always said. Sam built more pens, added stalls, and even converted part of the barn into a small shelter. Together they called it Haven Hollow, a name that made visitors smile, as if hope itself had been given an address. One of their frequent visitors was Emily Watson, a retired school teacher from Milford. She was in her late 60s, small and round-shouldered, with soft white curls framing a face that had the kindness of a grandmother and the spark of someone who had never stopped learning. Emily volunteered twice a week, bringing homemade biscuits and reading aloud to Martha while they brushed the animals. "They say plants grow faster when you talk to them," Emily often said with a wink. "Maybe it works on goats, too." Her laughter rang clear through the barn, often making Sam shake his head in amused disbelief. Then there was Tommy Hill, a local boy of about 12, thin and freckled, with hair the color of straw and an untamable grin. He had lost his father young and spent more time at Cedar Creek than at home. Martha took him under her wing, teaching him how to feed the animals, how to mend fences, and how to listen to the wind, the creek, and the silence between. Duke adored him, following him around like an old guardian, patient even when Tommy's energy bordered on chaos. Life moved gently in this small corner of the world. The seasons spun in slow, deliberate turns. Summer brought fireflies that lit the fields at dusk. Autumn spread gold across the trees. Winter painted the barns in frost, and spring returned with soft rains and newborn life. The farm became known not just as a refuge for animals, but as a place where weary souls, both human and otherwise, found healing. Some nights, travelers stopped by just to sit on the porch, drinking coffee and listening to the quiet hum of crickets. Martha never asked questions. She simply offered warmth, a meal, and the comfort of belonging. But even in peace, time has its price. Duke had begun to tire easily. His once keen ears were now slow to catch distant sounds, and his walks around the fields grew shorter with each passing week. Martha noticed the change, though she never spoke of it. Some evenings, she would sit on the porch steps and watch him limp through the tall grass, his fur catching the light of the setting sun. The sight broke her heart and healed it all at once. "You've done enough, old boy," she would whisper. "You can rest soon." Sam, too, noticed. One evening, after finishing repairs on the old gate, he joined her on the porch. "He's slowing down," Sam said quietly, his eyes following the dog's path. Martha nodded. So are we. He chuckled softly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. She turned to him, her gaze tender. You think the world will remember us, Sam? He smiled, reaching for her hand. Doesn't need to. The land does. That's enough. As the sun dipped low, casting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Duke came to rest at their feet, letting out a long, contented sigh. Hope and her grown foal grazed lazily in the distance, the creek glinting like liquid glass. The air was heavy with the scent of wild mint and clover. Then, as if the evening had been waiting for it, Martha leaned her head against Sam's shoulder and said softly, You know, Sam, Duke didn't just save Hope that night. He saved us too. Sam looked at her, his eyes glistening in the fading light. Yeah, he whispered. He sure did. For a long while, they sat in silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. The creek murmured, the wind carried the gentle song of distant crickets, and Duke lay still between them, eyes half closed, his tail twitching once in quiet contentment. The last light of the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the old field in gold. The years behind them no longer felt like loss. They were chapters in a story that had finally come full circle. Martha smiled, faintly, her hand resting on Duke's head. We're home, she whispered, echoing the words she had spoken long ago, and for the first time, she felt them completely true. The evening wind rose gently, rustling through the cedar trees. It carried no sorrow this time, only peace. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles in flashes of light or grand voices from the sky. Sometimes he sends them quietly, in the shape of a loyal old dog, a gentle man with weathered hands, or the whisper of wind across a forgotten field. Cedar Creek was never just a place. It was a reminder that no life is ever too broken to be rebuilt, and no heart too old to feel love again. When Martha returned, she didn't just find her home. She found God's grace waiting there all along, patient and kind, wrapped in fur and sunlight. And maybe, somewhere in your own life, there's a Cedar Creek waiting, a place or a moment where God is calling you to start again. So, if this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment about your own second chance. And don't forget to subscribe, because every story here reminds us, miracles still happen, every day, if we only have the faith to see them. May God bless you and keep you safe, wherever your journey leads.